What's up, guys? It's Concitus, and this week we're going to be talking about the lore from Ring of Elysium. The thing to realize about Ring of Elysium is that it's a relatively new game. New games often don't have a lot of story behind them, a lot of backbone. Things like Fortnite, the story was an afterthought. Things like, even Blackout has very little to no story. But with Ring of Elysium, there's actually much more than I bargained for. All of this lore that I'm about to read to you and tell you about is from the old map. We just got a new map just a few days ago, and it's got a completely different story than the old one, which sadly makes this video outdated, but good to keep on record in case the stories come back around. So the very first segment of the notes and lore page on Ring of Elysium is, in the mountain region of Dion, every few years an extremely dangerous cold front known as Ymir sweeps through the area. It has killed many people before, and it is almost impossible to predict. Now, that's very different from the new map that we just got, which happens to be a tropical island, which has volcanic ash surrounding you instead of, a blizzard. But the interesting thing about Ring of Elysium isn't that there's a blizzard going on and you have to escape. That's, the base story. That's very superficial. There's a completely underlying story about a serial killer. The next paragraph here talks about basically just that. Approximately 4 years after the last Ymir, a suspected serial killer is presumed to have fled to the Dion mountain region. He had previously killed 7 people and is very dangerous. Only a week after this, a 9-year-old girl is reported missing and later spotted with the serial killer. 2 weeks later, the serial killer murders an elderly woman in Siegel Castle and is seen fleeing the scene in the direction of Mount Snow. The Dion police force prepares a search on Mount Snow, but due to bad weather, they are forced to wait a few days. Meanwhile, they are closely monitoring all the roads to and from Mount Snow to make sure the suspect doesn't escape. A week later, they are finally able to search the mountain, but find nothing. Carl, who works in the police force, is an assistant to Peter, writes about the crazy people in Blue Peak Town who believe that Ymir is God's wrath and do all kinds of rituals. He also discovers that 35 years ago, a woman was killed there with a deity statue. You've probably already noticed the one big glaring problem in Ring of Elysium storytelling, and it's that all the people have super normal names. There's no last names. It's just Carl, Peter, Joseph, blah, 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 but this is where it gets interesting when the serial killer shows up. So we have all this lore here. There's a lot more on this page that I'm not exactly going to get into because we don't have a lot of backstory on that. But the next thing I want to talk about is the murder mystery event that just recently happened at the beginning of January. These murder mystery cases, they ranged from January 2nd until January 15th of this year, and there are 7 cases in all, and each case, I believe, had 3 clues to them. So you would have to go onto the website so that you could find the place for the first clue, and then follow those along until you finish the case, and you'd be rewarded with in-game items. But I honestly think the story is really gripping, and I read all 7 cases the other day, but I'm not going to read them all to you because there's just so much to read. I spent hours and hours reading these. It took me almost a whole day. So what you want to know is that there's the sheriff, Peter, who we heard about in the other lore tab. There's his partner, his new partner, Joseph, Tracy, one of the investigators, and Gilbert, who's the head of the cult in Blue Peak Town. Now, there's a few main things to note about the serial killer. Each of the victims that they found, which in total was 7, all had holes in their neck, 4 separate holes. So originally the private thought it might be a vampire, but the sheriff wasn't so convinced. But under the very first body, they found a blood smearing of a hexagram, so they thought maybe it could have been some sort of ritual from the cult, but it turned out to not be that. And it ended up being animal's blood. It wasn't even the person's blood. Another thing to note about case 1, as it's repeated throughout the cases, is that the girl who was killed was missing a small ruby necklace. It wasn't actually ruby. It was just, a cheap one. Their family wasn't very rich, but it's not the price that's important. So it wasn't a theft. It was more of like a souvenir for the killer. Serial killers have been known over time to take souvenirs from their victims, and so the police were hoping to find out what it was that he was looking for so that they could capture the killer. So from here, I'm going to be going a little bit faster through the cases because with the amount of time that I've allotted for this, I don't think I'll be able to fit them all in. The next victim was a young albino man who had gone out snowboarding in the middle of the night. The thing about him was that his eyes had been ripped out, but it didn't look like somebody else had done it, and he had blood on his fingers, so he was somehow either forced or made to take his own eyes out with his hands, which would have been excruciating, as you can all imagine. But the interesting thing about the body, besides the missing eyes, were that his arms had been sliced open to look like wings, so he was like an angel almost, laying on the ground. The next victim was a young woman who had been strung up to look like she was on a crucifix. The difference was that they had replaced her head with a goat's head, and they had also cut her thumbs off. Her head was eventually sent via post to the police office, and when they searched her house, they did find a picture of her on her phone in which her thumbnails were painted red. The victim of case 4 was a kind of a deadbeat young woman who had, gone off the rails and spent a lot of time in the police office. So the assistant actually did recognize her when they walked up. But the thing about her was that half of her head was shaved, like her hair had been taken. It wasn't like that before. Obviously, the assistant had seen her around. And also they had sliced open her abdomen, and so her, entrails were laying on the ground, and they had put a small lamb inside of her stomach. That's going to be important when the police go to the cult and say, why was this lamb inside of her stomach, after they had talked to her boyfriend who had said they convinced her to get an abortion, which didn't actually happen. Her baby was stillborn, and the cult convinced her to remove it so that she could, be at peace with it. She had actually just recently joined said cult. Case 5 is a little bit more interesting, I'd say, because it was a young boy who had been chopped up into pieces and then hung from a gigantic elk statue. In the game, this elk statue has got to be 20 feet tall, so it's not like, anybody could do this with ease, but the police said that there was no tracks, no anything around the body that would suggest that, they put him up there with like a crane or something like that. No ladders or anything like that. So somebody would have had to just scale this gigantic elk statue, which would be just incredible. The thing about him was that in his abdomen, there was like a hexagram carved into it, just like was under the first woman's body. And inside they found out that, his heart had been removed as a souvenir for the killer. Whenever the police find this body, they're trying to connect the cases somehow. They can't figure out how these people are connected at all. And then it hits them. They look at the map, and the shape that the killings make, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're pointing into a star. And they find the last point, which is a bathtub filled with blood. And this bathtub is actually meant for Gilbert, who they just barely miss being killed by the serial killer, by the murderer. He's in the house and he just barely escapes from them. Gilbert has had his mouth sliced from ear to ear. I imagine it as the Joker, but it's also sewed up with red thread, which makes Gilbert's death even more interesting because he was taking from these people different souvenirs and things like that. But when he killed Gilbert, he was able to not take anything, but he left a red thread behind. That seems interesting, like it might come back around, but we're not sure yet. Now, Tracy, right after she entered Gilbert's house, saw the killer and chased after him. She eventually took some shots at him as he tried to hang glide away, and she believes she hit one, so Right after this, Ymir hits and they're forced to evacuate, but the police, knowing that they can't let the killer escape from here, decide to check every single person on the way out for somebody with like a gunshot wound or some sort of infection, things like that. They eventually get on a chase with some people. Tracy is chasing these people that she thinks may be the killer. It turns out that this was nothing more than someone who was trying to smuggle guns out of the valley. And then Joseph actually runs into the real killer. He chases them down, and the sheriff follows later after going to find Tracy. But by the time they get to Joseph, he's already dead. His ears cut off, and he's hanging from a tree in the shape of a tarot card. I'm not very familiar on tarot cards, but it's the Hanging Man tarot card. So Joseph is dead now, Gilbert is dead, and now the sheriff decides to stay behind because he's going to catch this killer. And that's where the game picks up. When you are dropped into the game, this is what's happening. The sheriff has decided to stay behind. The killer is still on the loose, and Ymir is setting in. It's coming, and there's only a few spots on the helicopter left to go. So guys, that's all for the Ring of Elysium lore. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like and subscribe down below. I'm going to leave some links to my different channels in the description. If you really like the video and you want to hear more about the lore, I'd be happy to do it. I had a great time making this video. Just let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one.